Over here. And these are all journals, conference papers. I have copies of Berhane Salam.
Berhane Salam.
Yeah.
Berhane Salam. Yeah.
No, I don't have the very earliest one.
No, the 1936. No, Haile Selassie's time.
From the Haile Selassie time, I think I've got almost everything. And I've got all the Ethiopia in the World Press, which I've had bound. And I've got all the Addis Reporter, for example, which I had bound, which takes me about 30 years to collect the individual copy.
These
are the conference papers, Journal of Ethiopian Studies, Storia, and of course Pankhurst's Ethiopia Observer.
Oh, okay.
I have all of those.
So I need one month to come and to see all the books.
Yes.
So thank you again for agreeing to meet me in Addis. Ahead of our conversation, I'm sharing a brief list of interview questions, but I think you will do it by yourself. I don't have to ask every time. It will be about your work and motivation about this event, that's this story, on the massacre and the responsibility, on the memory, about the Asinara memorial, and your personal reflection, because this will help us to guide our exchange and ensure we'll stay focused on when we will be there.
That's right. Well, as far as motivation is concerned, I mean, that's an interesting question, especially as I didn't set out to do any of this research. It came about by chance. I was working on the monastery of Debre Libanos on a completely different topic, and was told about a certain massacre that took place during the Italian occupation, which I'd never heard about. So the Ethiopian friend that I was working with, Degefi Gebetsadik, and I decided to follow this up and to find out more about it, which we did. And that culminated in the book, The Massacre of Debre Libanos, in fact. But that led to the understanding that there had been a massacre in Addis Abeba. And it was that massacre and the aftermath that triggered the massacre of Debre Libanos. So one thing led to another, and we became more and more interested. If thousands of people died in this massacre, how come it's never been documented? Who were these people who died? What happened? the only thing that had ever been written was that two Eritreans, Abrahadabot and Mogus Ascadon, had attacked Graziani, and that had triggered the massacre, and that's all we knew. After that, it just became something that the thread never stopped being pulled. We didn't get to the end for many years. In fact, my research into the massacre of Addis Abeba took about 25 years, trying to find out exactly who did what, who planned the attack on Graziani, why did they do it, why did the massacre take place, who was responsible, and so on. So it was done really for posterity, and that was the objective. The feeling that so many people had died and had been forgotten about. Nothing had really been written about them. And when I started talking to survivors of the massacre, the people who lived to tell the tale, it became quite a dramatic story. Hence the books that have appeared on the subject. So it was just that one thing led to another. It wasn't a plan. My interest in Ethiopian history is actually very broad, not just the Italian occupation. But that was the motive, just to do something for posterity, because I soon became aware, as Professor Richard Pankhurst, who helped me, used to point out, if we don't do this now, it will never be done. Which, of course, is true, because almost all of the witnesses, in fact, all of the witnesses of the massacre except one, have died since we did this research. So that more or less summarizes the motivation. As far as the massacre of Addis Abeba is concerned, the first thing to understand about the massacre and who was behind it is that it was not a single event. It was half a dozen fairly separate events, each of which was the responsibility of different people. This explains why there's been so much controversy as to how many people died in the massacre of Addis Abeba. Because the people who are asked that question were maybe only thinking about the phase that they knew about, not about the totality of what we now call the massacre of Addis Abeba. For example, when the attack on Graziani took place, more than 2,000 Ethiopians were shot and killed by various means within the palace grounds. Within the grounds, that is, of the government of Italy at the time. This is because there was a reflex action by the armed soldiers to the attack on Graziani, which would have happened in any such context, not necessarily planned. There was an expectation by the Italian High Command that there would be an attack by the patriots on that day. They'd been tipped off that there was going to be trouble, so they were trigger happy. That is the first phase of the massacre of Addis Abeba. The second phase was planned in the sense that there was a standing procedure that if there is an emergency at the palace, then the Italians would in effect draw a cordon of a 400-meter radius around the palace, and any Ethiopian within that cordon was likely to be killed. And actually it was the Air Force that was in charge of that procedure, who were stationed at the Menelik II school. So the moment they came up to the palace, when the alarm was sent, they started shooting people. The black shirts moved in and started shooting any Ethiopians who were within that what I call the circle of death.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Ioannishet, a Peshawarid, as a child, walked through that circle of death with her mother, Sarah, who was one of the key witnesses for the massacre for my research. So that was planned in advance, not as a result of the attack on Graziani. It was a set procedure. So some thousands of Ethiopians died in that period. Then you had the black shirts coming down from the garrison, which was near the Tefarima Collins School. More or less freeloading, wild soldiers, if you like, much less disciplined than the regulars, who then started attacking Ethiopians outside of the circle. And that went on until lunchtime on that Friday. And then at lunchtime, a curfew was declared. And all the Ethiopian men who could be found by the Italians were rounded up. And most of them, certainly a high proportion of them, were killed in detention. So again, you had another phase and so on. The most notorious phase of the massacre of Addis Abeba was the phase organized in some detail by Guido Cortese, who was in charge of the fascist party, and therefore could be said to be in charge of the black shirts, as opposed to being in charge of the regular soldiers. And he organized for the Taveri garrison of black shirts to come down and make a systematic attack on certain residential areas, the high-density residential areas of Addis Ababa. That was kind of very well organized. The black shirts had access to their trucks and to their weapons. And as soon as it fell dark, as soon as darkness fell, they moved into these areas, such as the Serabate Sefer, where traditionally the servants of the palace would live. And they set fire to those houses, and many people died in the houses. You had further phases then the following day, which was a Saturday. There was another phase the day after that, the Sunday. So coming back to the point I just made, the massacre was a series of incidents, not a single decision.
So what about memories in recognition about this situation of the memory of the victims?
Yes. Well, memory is actually what it's all about. I didn't do what historians are normally expected to do, which is to rely on documents and then interpret, because there were no documents. So the whole exercise was to do with memory. Memory on the part of people who were there at the time, who I managed to trace and talk to, and memory of just about 2 or 3 people who had written in their memoirs their recollections of what happened during the massacre. So there were no documents on the massacre as such. So my job was really to find all the memories that could be found and to cross-check them with the documented facts. The documented facts would not be about the massacre as such, but would be, for example, which areas of the town were burned at certain times, what were the military movements by the Italians, they're all documented. What were the black shirts doing on certain days, and so on. Cross-checking what I was told with the geography of the city, for example, which was rather different then from what it is today and what it was when I was doing the research. So it was memories that was the ingredient of all of my work, and often having to triangulate and cross-check those memories, because people sometimes remember things which were not true. They think they remember something, but they might be confused about what they've remembered. I had a good example of this where one of the people who knew Abrahadabotch and Mogus Ascadon very well, and actually lived with Mogus Ascadon, recalled what happened on a certain evening. And in the room, when I was interviewing him, was someone else who was also there at the time, but was his senior. And he turned around and said, "Aha, you were just a little boy. You don't really remember.
Okay.
I'm going to correct you." And he was able to put the story straight. And then the other fellow, who was much younger, he was only about 90. The man who was correcting him was 101.
Oh.
So he said, "Yes, you're right. Yes, that is correct." So a great deal of the work was, if you like, checking on memories, processing memories. And it comes in again in the motive for doing the work, which I mentioned earlier. The fact that what had happened had been largely forgotten and never documented was one of the things that drove me to do this work, because there was no memory in the public sense, in the communal sense. There were memories by individuals, what happened in this part of town on Friday at 8 o'clock, or what happened here Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, but no one had tried to put it together. So yes, it was basically an exercise in memory.
Do you believe that Ethiopia should create a national memorial for this, dedicated to the victims of?
Well, there is a memorial, and it's a very detailed memorial, and it's a very carefully researched memorial, and it's the one that is standing at Sidiskilo, sculptured by two renowned sculptors who did a great deal of research in order to create the tableaus which are on that memorial.
Yeah.
So the physical memorial is there. What I've tried to do is to translate it into the personal stories that need to be told. But in fact, that memorial, as I mentioned, is very detailed, but it stands in isolation. It doesn't have a context, so people just drive around the memorial and hardly notice it. So what I tried to do is to establish the facts. My book on the Massacre of Addis Abeba is not written as a captivating story. One of my reviewers said that it's written like a technical report. But that's deliberate, because I just wanted to record the facts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or any museum, to put it in a museum? Yes.
So far, no one has suggested that. I mean, we have a Holocaust museum, of course, which memorializes what happened during the Red Terror. When Yekatit Asrahulet, which is the local name given to the events of that day, was memorialized a few years ago, there was a temporary museum set up at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, to which I contributed some photographs. In fact, there were complaints laid by several Italian tourists that it should be closed down, because it wasn't something that should necessarily be talked about. So, yes, it might be contentious to have such a museum. It might not be. I haven't looked into that.
Yeah. Why is it unknown? This atrocity is not it's unknown in Europe. It's not known.
The atrocity is unknown.
Yeah, this Italian atrocity is not known in...
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, all my work on the occupation has been on the atrocities. Not because I think that's all there was to talk about. That is not a summary of the occupation. I wouldn't want anyone to think that the occupation was nothing more than a series of atrocities. But I chose to focus on the atrocities because of the memory dimension to it, which you mentioned. In general, the atrocities were covered up, largely by the British government, because basically Italy changed sides in the Second World War. They joined the Allies. And certainly the government of Great Britain and America didn't want to be thought to be in partnership with an ally that had been committing war crimes. So there was a great deal of obstruction by the British government when the Ethiopians tried to take the Italian government or the individuals concerned to court in the UN trials. And this is why basically the atrocities are largely unknown. If you compare it to the atrocities of the Japanese and the Germans, it is a completely different story. Of course, they were held accountable, but the Italians were not. And even though the fascists were, in a sense, held accountable in the defascistization process of Italy itself, still there were enough people in the system in Italy who didn't want to talk about what happened in Ethiopia.
So although you want to be able to attend the Asinara event, is there any message you would like to send to the descendant of those who were deported?
Yeah, well, first of all, please tell them that I would have very much liked to be there, but I've got too many commitments at the moment. I can't make it. I hope that my friend Uinashet will be able to make it, and I would have a special message to her to thank her for all the help she's given me over many years, and her mother and her aunt, who were also very helpful. I think the main message to the event is the importance of memorializing what happened. Again, the imprisonment of large numbers of Ethiopians, especially wives and their families, is almost unknown. Even in Ethiopia, it's almost unknown. And it's a story that needs to be told. So I think that the Asinara event, the initiative, is a very, very good one. And it's in the same spirit of making sure for posterity that these people are not forgotten.
Okay. Do you think there is a connection between the Addis Ababa massacre and the deportation to island like Asinara? Was there also an Italian effort to erase the history?
Oh, definitely. The imprisonment of Ethiopian families to Asinara was part of a program of repression ordered by Mussolini following the attack of Yekatit Asruhulet, the attack on Graziani. It's the attack on Graziani that triggered all of what happened afterwards. The massacre of Della, the massacre of Addis Abeba itself, the flying tribunals, as we call them, these sort of kangaroo courts that the Italians held throughout the countryside of Ethiopia, where they hanged all the leaders of hundreds of villages to get rid of the administration of Ethiopia, down to the local priests, the local chiefs, and so on, were hanged in gallows which were prefabricated in large numbers, which could hang up to 10 people at a time, and which would be taken out in trucks, military trucks, and would cruise through the villages, especially the Central Highlands. So all those things were part of a program designed to crush all the opposition. And interestingly, much of what happened here was replicated in Yugoslavia. And in some cases, even the same commanders who were doing it in Ethiopia were doing it in Yugoslavia when the Italians and the Germans, the Nazis, went into Yugoslavia. So those were planned pogroms, in fact, of repression to put down the continual resistance to Italian control.
But at the same time, those people who were in Asinara, they seem that they were well treated than comparing the...
So that is the paradox of Asinara. One of the things that Ioannis's mother really impressed upon me in the many meetings, discussions we had, was, in her view, as one of the prisoners, it was absurd because she could see that the Italians, the local Italians, were worse off in many ways than the Ethiopian prisoners were. The Ethiopians at least were put in decent housing and were given clothes. And many of the Italians had not enough to eat and were freezing in the winter. And she would continually ask, why are you doing this? In fact, her whole attitude towards the Italian administration here, I felt it struck me as strange. It was, she felt sorry for them in a way. I think she thought they were stupid. Mm-hmm. Why are you doing all this? You know, what's wrong with you?
Oh, yeah, there was young men.
And I think a lot of the Ethiopians actually came to look down on the Italian administration as being rather dim. I mean, what's the point of us being here and you having to feed us? And then they would move, not just in Asinara, but I mean, of course, Sarah was in the various locations, not just Asinara. They would put them into hospitals that would have a change of use as a sort of prison camp and so on. And she was relatively well off. She saw no point whatsoever in her imprisonment and her children. What was the objective? She never did find out. And that same state of mind, I think, comes through in what I mentioned in my book, is that when she came to be released, when the Duke of Aosta had taken over from Graziani, she was told to sign the form for her to be released, and she refused and said, you didn't ask me to sign a form to lock me up years ago. Why are you asking me to sign it now? And she absolutely refused. They tried to beg her, please sign it. But she wouldn't. But she was released anyway.
Yeah.
So the whole thing to her was an absurdity. Even on the flight out, she told me that the soldiers on the plane were showing her photographs, which were pornographic photographs that they'd taken, to see how she would react. All that sort of, I mean, crazy things. And spending all that money on an aeroplane just to take her and a couple of other people all the way to this island to achieve what? So the whole thing was like a dream. It was like some sort of crazy nightmare.
That's what I realized when I saw the pictures, Asinara pictures. It looks like a resort when the...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was different from Denane.
Denane.
Of course. The concentration camps were a completely different story, where people like Imru Zelika were imprisoned. They were really bad.
Yeah.
But the Asinara story is a very strange story. And one of the things which I have not done, because I'm not an Italian specialist, is to find out what the objective was. Should they think that these people were going to take over if they were not removed? Many of them were wives and children, you see. Like in Sarah's case, yes, her husband was killed in the palace building in the basement, which was used for torturing and interrogating people. One might have argued that, yes, he was a security risk, but his wife and children, what was that all about? So it would be good for an Italian scholar to go through the Italian material and try to find out what the objective was, but I couldn't find anything about it. Other than that it was part of this program of repression, of reaction to the attack.